Hey everyone, tonight we begin with a story that will make you grateful for every mundane Tuesday you've ever complained about. We're talking about the Black Death of 1347 to 1351, 4 years when Europe became a continental graveyard and survival wasn't about being the strongest or smartest, but about pure dumb luck. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this, you're a merchant in Kaffa, a bustling trading port on the Black Sea, in the autumn of 1346. The city smells like every port city you've ever visited, whole salt air mixed with fish, tar, and human sweat. But there's something else in the air now. Something wrong. Your neighbours have been whispering about strange deaths in the Eastern Territories, but you've got business to conduct, ships to load, money to make. The Mongol army has been besieging your city for months, and you're just trying to survive another day of warfare. Then the Mongols start catapulting corpses over your city walls. Not rocks, not flaming arrows, decomposing human bodies, bloated and black with disease. This isn't just psychological warfare, though it certainly is that. This is biological warfare, centuries before anyone understood what bacteria even were. The Mongols are dying from something horrific, and in their desperation, they're sharing it with everyone else. You watch these putrid projectiles arc over the walls and crash into your streets, and you think this siege can't possibly get worse. You're wrong. Within weeks, your neighbours start developing strange swellings. Golf ball-sized lumps appear in their armpits, necks, and groins. The lumps are called buboes, and they're so painful that grown men scream when you barely touch them. The swellings turn black and burst open, releasing a stench so foul it makes the rotting corpses seem pleasant by comparison. But here's what nobody tells you about the plague. It's not just one disease. You're actually facing 3 different bacterial nightmares, and each one wants to kill you in its own special way. The bubonic plague, the one everyone knows about, starts with those swellings. Your lymph nodes are desperately trying to filter out the Yersinia pestis bacteria flooding your system, but they're overwhelmed. The bacteria multiply so rapidly that your immune system essentially has a panic attack. You develop a fever that makes you feel like you're burning alive from the inside. Your head pounds with such intensity that light becomes physically painful. You can't keep food down, and even water tastes like metal. The worst part? You're still conscious through most of it. You can think clearly enough to understand exactly what's happening to your body as it betrays you piece by piece. The medieval chroniclers described victims becoming delirious, but that's actually the lucky ones. Many plague sufferers remain terrifyingly lucid right up until the end. Picture Elena, your neighbour's daughter. She's 12 years old and was selling fish at the market just 3 days ago. Now she's lying on a straw mattress, her small body racked with fever as a bubo the size of a chicken egg protrudes from her neck. Her mother holds her hand and sings lullabies, but Elena keeps asking why it hurts so much. She wants to know if she did something wrong, if God is angry with her. Her mother has no answers, because nobody does. Elena's father tried everything. He brought the priest, who sprinkled holy water and muttered Latin prayers. He brought the barber surgeon, who wanted to cut open the bubo with a rusty knife, without any form of pain relief, of course. He even paid for an astrologer who claimed the alignment of Mars and Saturn was causing the sickness. None of it mattered. Elena died on the 4th day, asking for her pet cat in her final moments. This scene repeats itself hundreds of times every day in your city. Children, adults, elderly people. The plague doesn't discriminate, but watching children die is somehow worse, because they haven't lived long enough to understand why suffering exists. They die confused and frightened, calling for their parents even as their parents are dying in the next room. Then there's pneumonic plague, which attacks your lungs. This version spreads through respiratory droplets, meaning every cough, every breath, every word becomes a potential death sentence for everyone around you. Your lungs fill with bloody foam that you cough up in violent, racking spasms. The sound alone is enough to clear a room, mates. A wet, gurgling wheeze that announces your condition to anyone within hearing distance. You literally drown in your own blood while gasping for air that never seems to satisfy your desperate lungs. Brother Marcus, the monk from the local monastery, contracts this version while administering last rites to the dying. He's a big man, built for physical labor, with hands like tree roots from years of copying manuscripts and tending gardens, but pneumonic plague reduces him to a whimpering child in 3 days. He can't lie down because the fluid in his lungs makes him feel like he's drowning. He can't sit up because the coughing fits are so violent they crack his ribs. He spends his final day propped against a wall, coughing up pink foam while trying to recite prayers between gasps for air. The irony isn't lost on anyone. Brother Marcus spent years copying medical texts, preserving the wisdom of ancient physicians. He knows more about Hippocrates and Galen than anyone in the city, but all that knowledge is useless against bacteria that won't be identified for another 500 years. The third variant, septicemic plague, skips the theatrical swellings and lung drama entirely. The bacteria goes straight into your bloodstream and starts shutting down your organs one by one. Your fingers and toes turn black as blood circulation fails. Your kidneys stop processing waste. Your liver gives up. It's like your body is conducting a controlled demolition on itself, and you get to experience every moment of the collapse. This is what happens to Alessandro, the goldsmith who lives 2 streets over. He's famous for creating intricate jewelry that wealthy merchants buy for their wives. His hands are his livelihood, steady, precise, capable of working with the tiniest details. But septicemic plague turns those skilled hands into blackened claws within hours. The tips of his fingers literally rot away while he's still alive. He sits at his workbench, staring at hands that can no longer hold a tool, wondering what sin he committed to deserve this specific punishment. Now, as you're watching your neighbors die in these uniquely horrible ways, you face a choice that no human being should ever have to make. Do you stay and help your community, or do you run? If you choose to help, you're almost certainly signing your own death warrant. There's no concept of quarantine or sterilization. People think the plague spreads through bad air or divine punishment for sin. So you'll be breathing the same air, touching the same surfaces, handling the same contaminated materials as the infected. Medieval medical treatment involves bloodletting, literally making sick people weaker, and prayers, lots and lots of prayers. Dr. Girolamo, the only physician in your district, exemplifies this tragic futility. He's studied at the University of Bologna, knows his Aristotle and his Arabic medical texts, and genuinely wants to help people. His treatments include burning aromatic herbs to purify the air, balancing the body's humours through bloodletting, and prescribing various herbal concoctions that would probably kill a healthy person. When people start developing buboes, Dr. Girolamo decides the best approach is to lance them with heated metal tools to release the corrupted blood. This procedure is exactly as horrifying as it sounds. Patients are held down while red-hot iron is pressed into their swollen lymph nodes. Most die from shock. The few who survive the procedure usually die from infection within days, because nobody understands the concept of sterile equipment. Dr. Girolamo performs these tortures with genuine compassion, holding patients' hands and whispering encouragement while essentially cooking their infected tissue. He thinks he's helping. He thinks medical science is on his side, when he inevitably contracts plague himself, probably from handling infected tissue with his bare hands. He tries to treat himself with the same methods. His assistant finds him dead at his desk, surrounded by bloody surgical tools and half-finished medical notes describing his own symptoms. But if you run, where exactly are you going? This isn't a localized outbreak. Trade routes that once carried silk and spices are now carrying death across 3 continents. Every port city, every major trade hub, every crossroads where people gather, they're all becoming plague pits. The very interconnectedness that made medieval commerce possible is now ensuring that nowhere is safe. Let's say you decide to flee anyway. You pack whatever you can carry and head out on foot. Because horses are dying too, not from plague, but from starvation. Because there aren't enough living people left to care for them. The roads are littered with abandoned carts, scattered belongings, and corpses in various stages of decomposition. Some bodies have been picked clean by ravens and wild dogs. Others are so fresh, you can still see the fear frozen on their faces. Your first night on the road, you shelter in an abandoned inn called the Golden Pheasant. The sign still creaks in the wind, and there are half-empty wine cups sitting on tables, as if the patrons just stepped outside for fresh air. But the wine has turned to vinegar, and there are flies buzzing around plates of mouldy food. You find the innkeeper's family in their private quarters, mother, father, and twin boys, about 8 years old, all dead in the same bed. The father's arm is still wrapped around his wife's shoulders. You want to bury them, but you don't have tools for digging graves. You want to say prayers, but you're not sure prayers work anymore. Instead, you close the door gently and try to sleep in the common room, listening to rats scurrying through the walls and wind rattling the shutters. Every sound makes you jump, because isolation is already playing tricks with your mind. You avoid major cities, obviously, but even small villages are death traps. You approach a farming hamlet, hoping to trade for food, and you find houses with doors hanging open. Meals still sitting on tables, covered in flies, entire families dead in their beds. Sometimes you find survivors, but they're often in the final stages themselves, delirious with fever, begging for water, asking you to stay with them so they don't die alone. In one village, you encounter Maria, a woman about your age, who's tending to her dying mother while her own fever is climbing. She's been alone for weeks, since her husband and children succumbed to plague. Her mother keeps asking for her son Maria's brother, who died 2 months ago. But Maria doesn't have the heart to remind a dying woman that she's lost yet another child. Maria begs you to help her move her mother to a more comfortable position. It's such a simple request, such a basic human kindness. But touching plague victims means contamination. Contamination means death. So you stand in the doorway, watching this woman struggle to care for her dying mother alone. And you do nothing. You offer words of sympathy, but words don't lift dying bodies, or provide clean water, or change soiled bedding. The guilt of these encounters follows you for miles. Every person you couldn't help, every outstretched hand you ignored, every plea for company that you denied, because your own survival depended on avoiding human contact. You start to understand why some survivors go mad, not from fear of death, but from the weight of all the small cruelties that survival requires. And here's the thing that really gets to you. You want to help them. Every decent instinct you have screams at you to give them water, to comfort them, to at least close their eyes when they pass. But doing so probably means joining them in a few days. So you keep walking, carrying the weight of every person you couldn't save, every outstretched hand you ignored. Food becomes your constant obsession. Farms are abandoned, crops rotting in fields because there's nobody left to harvest them. You come across apple orchards where fruit is falling off trees and rotting on the ground while you're slowly starving. But you don't know which farms might be contaminated. You don't know if eating fruit that grew near plague corpses might carry the disease. Paranoia makes every meal a gamble with death. Grain stores are either empty or guarded by desperate survivors who'll kill you for a handful of wheat. You learn to recognize which fruits and roots are edible, because starvation is competing with plague to see which will kill you first. Your stomach cramps constantly, and you catch yourself eyeing dead horses on the side of the road, wondering if the meat is still good. When you do find food, it's often spoiled or insufficient. You discover a hidden cache of dried meat in an abandoned farmhouse, but it's already growing mold. Do you eat moldy meat and risk getting sick, or do you continue starving and risk dying anyway? You eat the meat. It tastes like wet leather and makes you vomit for hours, but some nutrients probably stayed down. Water is another nightmare. Wells in populated areas are often contaminated with corpses. People either threw infected bodies down wells, thinking it would hide the smell, or bodies fell in after entire communities died. You learn to look for running streams far from any settlement, but even then you're never sure what's upstream. Everything tastes suspicious. Everything might be your last meal. You develop a ritual around drinking water. First, you examine it in sunlight, looking for unusual colors or floating debris. Then you smell it, checking for the sweet sick odor of decomposition. Finally, you take the smallest possible sip and wait, listening to your body for any signs of nausea or cramping. It's exhausting to turn every basic biological need into a life or death decision. Sleep becomes a luxury you can't afford. Not just because you're constantly moving, but because lying down, closing your eyes, making yourself vulnerable, it feels like giving up. What if you develop a fever during the night? What if you wake up with swellings in your neck? What if you don't wake up at all? You find yourself checking your armpits obsessively, feeling for any unusual lumps, monitoring every ache and pain for signs that your time is up. The lack of sleep creates its own problems. You start hallucinating after the first week, seeing movement in your peripheral vision, hearing voices calling your name. Sometimes you think you smell cooking food, only to realize you're fantasizing about meals from your childhood. Your judgment becomes impaired, making basic survival decisions unnecessarily difficult. One night, exhausted beyond reason, you fall asleep next to a creek, about 30 miles outside Florence. You wake up to find wolf tracks in the mud inches from where your head was resting. Wolves are becoming bolder as human settlements empty out, and a lone traveler represents an easy meal. You realize you nearly became dinner because you were too tired to stay alert. The psychological toll might be worse than the physical suffering. You start to see death everywhere. A shadow in your peripheral vision becomes a corpse. A distant sound becomes someone's death rattle. You develop a paranoia so intense that you avoid all human contact, even though isolation is slowly driving you insane. You talk to yourself constantly, just to hear a human voice, but sometimes you forget what your own voice sounds like. After weeks alone, you begin having conversations with imaginary companions, dead friends, family members, even people you barely knew. It's comforting at first, but gradually becomes disturbing as the line between memory and hallucination blurs. Sometimes you argue with these phantom voices. Sometimes you catch yourself setting aside food for people who aren't really there. Religion becomes simultaneously more important and completely meaningless. You pray constantly for protection, for food, for the strength to keep going, but you're also watching devout priests and nuns die just as horribly as everyone else. If God exists, he's either punishing humanity for something unimaginable, or he's simply not paying attention. Neither possibility is particularly comforting. In Siena, you witness something that shakes whatever faith you have left. The local cathedral is being used as a makeshift hospital, and dozens of plague victims lie dying on the altar steps. A group of flagellants, religious fanatics, who whip themselves as penance for humanity's sins, process through the cathedral, bleeding from self-inflicted wounds while chanting prayers. They believe their suffering will convince God to end the plague. Instead, their open wounds become infected, and they begin dying of sepsis within days. But they continue the flagellation even as they're dying, convinced that more suffering equals more divine favour. You watch a 12-year-old boy whip his own back until the muscle is visible, while his mother holds him and sobs. The boy dies 3 days later, not from plague, but from the infections caused by his religious devotion. Let's say you somehow make it through 6 months of this hell. You're probably suffering from severe malnutrition, chronic dehydration, and what we'd now recognize as severe PTSD. Your clothes are falling apart, your hair is falling out, and you haven't had a proper bath in so long that you've stopped noticing your own smell. You've probably witnessed more death than most soldiers see in entire wars. Your body has adapted to constant stress in ways that will never fully reverse. You're hypervigilant to the point of exhaustion, jumping at every unexpected sound. Your digestive system, accustomed to irregular and poor quality food, struggles with anything rich or substantial. Your sleep patterns are permanently disrupted by nightmares and anxiety. But perhaps worst of all, you've lost the ability to trust your own perceptions. After months of hallucinations, paranoia, and isolation, you're no longer sure what's real. When you finally encounter other survivors, you sometimes wonder if they're actual people or elaborate fantasies created by your damaged mind. And then, if you're incredibly lucky, you start encountering other survivors. At first, this seems like salvation, human contact, shared resources, maybe even the beginning of community again. But survivor communities in plague times aren't heartwarming tales of human resilience. They're often brutal, suspicious groups where trust is a luxury nobody can afford. You meet Francesco, a miller who survived by barricading himself in his windmill for 4 months, eating nothing but stored grain and rainwater. He's gaunt, paranoid, and armed with a collection of knives that he's clearly willing to use. Francesco hasn't spoken to another human being in so long that he's forgotten how to modulate his voice. He either whispers or shouts, with no middle ground. Francesco tells you about the community that formed in his village, about 20 survivors who banded together for mutual protection. It sounds promising until he describes what happened when food became scarce. The group turned on each other, literally fighting over scraps. Francesco watched neighbors who'd known each other for decades beat each other to death over a moldy loaf of bread. He left in the middle of the night and hasn't trusted anyone since. Everyone is traumatized. Everyone has lost family, friends, everything they once cared about. Some survivors become almost pathologically generous, giving away their last scraps of food because material possessions seem meaningless after losing everything. Others become violently protective of any resources, ready to kill for a moldy piece of bread or a clean cup of water. You encounter both extremes in the ruins of a monastery near Pisa. Brother Thomas, one of only 3 surviving monks, insists on sharing the monastery's remaining food stores with any traveller who passes through. He's convinced that generosity will earn divine protection. Meanwhile, Brother Benedict has claimed the monastery's wine cellar as his personal territory and threatens violence against anyone who approaches. Both monks are probably insane, but they're coping with trauma in opposite ways. The third surviving monk, Brother Paul, has stopped speaking entirely. He spends his days copying the same Bible verse over and over. And I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and his name that sat on him was Death, and hell followed with him. He's filled dozens of pages with this single sentence, written in increasingly erratic handwriting as his sanity deteriorates. You'll meet people who've become religious fanatics, convinced that extreme penance will save them from further divine wrath. They whip themselves until they bleed, sometimes spreading infection through their open wounds. You'll meet others who've decided that if the world is ending, they might as well enjoy whatever time they have left, leading to orgies, drinking parties, and general debauchery in plague-ridden cities. In Avignon, you discover a group of survivors who've turned the papal palace into a den of hedonistic excess. They're convinced that since prayer and virtue didn't save anyone from plague, sin and pleasure must be the answer. They spend their days drinking communion wine and their nights in elaborate orgies among the religious artifacts. It's simultaneously sacrilegious and deeply sad, people grasping for any sensation that makes them feel alive in a world dominated by death. The economy, meanwhile, has completely collapsed. Money is worthless when there's nothing to buy and nobody to sell to. You witness a former nobleman trying to trade a bag of gold coins for a single chicken, being refused because chickens provide eggs, while gold provides nothing. Social hierarchies that seemed permanent just vanish overnight. A noble's title means nothing when he's begging for scraps alongside former peasants. But this social leveling isn't liberating. It's terrifying, because all the structures that once provided stability and predictability are gone. Nobody knows who's in charge anymore. Nobody knows what laws still apply. Nobody knows what happens when someone commits murder in a world where traditional justice has collapsed. You witness this firsthand when you encounter two men fighting over a horse. One claims to be a knight, entitled to the animal by right of nobility. The other claims to be a horse trader who found the animal wandering loose and therefore owns it by salvage rights. The argument escalates to violence, and the supposed knight kills the horse trader with a sword. In the old world, this might have been justice or murder, depending on the legal details and social status of those involved. In the plague world, it's just two desperate men fighting over resources, and one of them is now dead. The surviving knight takes the horse and rides away, but you notice his hands shaking as he mounts. He's not a killer by nature. He's just been forced into a situation where violence was the only way to survive. If you do survive Nine Sand, remember, your odds are roughly 40% at best. You'll emerge into a world that's fundamentally changed. Entire bloodlines have been wiped out. The Medici family, which will later become synonymous with Renaissance banking and politics, loses dozens of members to plague. Skilled craftsmen who spent decades perfecting their trades are dead, taking their knowledge with them. In Florence, the guild system that regulated commerce and maintained quality standards has essentially collapsed. Master craftsmen who were supposed to train apprentices are dead. Apprentices who were supposed to learn trades are dead. Journeymen who connected different workshops are dead. The intricate network of professional relationships that made medieval commerce possible has been severed at every point. Libraries and schools are empty or destroyed. The University of Bologna, one of Europe's oldest and most prestigious institutions, closes for 2 years because there aren't enough students or faculty left to maintain operations. When it reopens, most of the curriculum has to be rebuilt from scratch, because the scholars who maintained academic traditions are gone. Art, music, literature, whole cultural traditions have simply disappeared. You meet Giovanni, a former cathedral musician who survived plague but lost his entire choir. He knows hundreds of sacred songs, complex musical arrangements that took generations to develop and refine. But music is a communal art form, and there's nobody left to sing with. Giovanni sits alone in empty churches, humming melodies that will die with him because there's no way to preserve them. The survivors often develop a fatalistic worldview that's hard to shake. You've seen too much arbitrary death to believe in long-term planning. Why build anything permanent when it could all disappear tomorrow? Why form deep relationships when everyone you love might be dead by next month? Why worry about sin or virtue when good people and evil people died exactly the same horrible deaths? This fatalism affects every aspect of daily life. Farmers plant smaller crops because they don't expect to live long enough to harvest them. Merchants make shorter-term trades because long-term contracts seem pointless. Parents are reluctant to invest emotionally in their children because child mortality rates are astronomical even by medieval standards. You notice this attitude in Anna, a woman you meet in the ruins of Genoa. She's pregnant, apparently conceived shortly after losing her husband and 2 previous children to plague. When you congratulate her on the pregnancy, she shrugs and says she's not making any plans for the baby. No names picked out, no clothes prepared, no hopes or dreams articulated. She's protecting herself from attachment because she's learned that loving something just makes losing it more painful. But here's what's truly haunting about the plague years. Life goes on. Even in the worst hit areas, some people survive. Crops still need to be planted. Animals still need to be fed. Children are still born, even as their parents die. The human capacity to adapt to unthinkable circumstances is both inspiring and deeply disturbing. You learn to step over corpses on your way to the market. You learn to have conversations about dinner plans while standing next to mass graves. You learn to fall in love, to laugh at jokes, to worry about mundane problems even while living through the collapse of civilization. The human mind simply can't sustain constant crisis mode. It starts treating horror as normal just to keep functioning. In Marseille, you encounter a couple planning their wedding while bodies are still being burned in the city squares. They're not callous or insane, they're just adapting to circumstances beyond their control. They've decided that if the world is ending, they want to spend whatever time remains together. Their wedding feast consists of bread, wine, and preserved meat scavenged from abandoned houses. And their marriage bed is a straw mattress in a half-empty church. But they're genuinely happy, perhaps because happiness has been redefined by context. And that's perhaps the most unsettling part of this entire story. It's not that the Black Death was uniquely evil, or that the people who lived through it were uniquely unfortunate. It's that humans can adapt to almost anything, which means that unthinkable suffering can become just another Tuesday if it goes on long enough. The plague didn't just kill bodies, it killed the assumption that tomorrow would be recognizably similar to today. It killed the belief that planning for the future was rational. It killed the idea that human civilization was permanent or even particularly stable. And once you've lived through that kind of collapse, you never quite trust stability again. Survivors develop what we might call collapse anxiety, a constant, low-level fear that normality is temporary and disaster is always just around the corner. They hoard food obsessively, even when supplies are adequate. They avoid forming deep attachments because loss feels inevitable. They make decisions based on worst-case scenarios because they've lived through situations where the worst case actually happened. You see this in Roberto, a survivor you encounter near Rome 2 years after the plague's peak. He's managed to rebuild a small farm and is living relatively comfortably, but he still sleeps with weapons within reach and maintains multiple escape routes from his property. He can't enjoy a meal without wondering if it might be his last. He can't form friendships without calculating how he'd cope if those friends suddenly died. Roberto's hypervigilance isn't irrational. It's learned behavior based on lived experience. He's adapted to a world where catastrophe is normal, and he can't simply turn off that adaptation when circumstances improve. The plague changed not just medieval society, but the medieval mind in ways that persisted for generations. So the next time you're annoyed by a long line at the grocery store, or frustrated by traffic, or worried about some minor inconvenience, Remember that you're living in a world where these are actually problems worth having. You're living in a world where you can reasonably expect to wake up tomorrow, where you can make plans for next week, where you can assume that the people you love will probably still be alive when you see them again. That assumption, that baseline expectation of continuity, is a luxury that plague survivors never quite recovered. They'd lived through the proof that everything can disappear in a matter of months, and that knowledge changed them forever. The Black Death ended not because humans conquered it, but because it essentially ran out of victims. In some regions, 60% of the population simply died. The plague retreated not because of medical intervention or divine mercy, but because there weren't enough people left to sustain transmission. It was a mathematical solution to a biological problem, and the mathematics were written in corpses. Those who survived didn't survive because they were stronger, smarter, more virtuous, or better prepared. They survived because random chance decided their particular flea bite didn't carry quite enough bacteria, or because their specific genetic makeup happened to provide marginally better resistance, or because they happened to be in the right place at the right time when the wind was blowing in the right direction. In other words, they survived for the same reason you probably wouldn't have pure arbitrary luck. And that, more than all the vivid descriptions of suffering and death, might be the most terrifying part of this entire story. In a world where survival depends entirely on chance, all the preparation, all the knowledge, all the good intentions in the world won't save you. You'd be just another corpse in just another mass grave, remembered by nobody, because everyone who might have remembered you would be dead too. The plague survivors who rebuilt Europe after 1351 were haunted by this knowledge for the rest of their lives. They knew, in a way that we can barely comprehend, that human civilization is far more fragile than we like to admit. They knew that everything we take for granted, safety, stability, the assumption that tomorrow will come to disappear faster than we can adapt to its absence. And perhaps that's the real lesson of the Black Death. Not that medieval people were primitive or unlucky, but that we're living on borrowed time in a universe that doesn't care about our plans, our hopes, or our assumption that life should make sense. The plague didn't create that reality. It just made it impossible to ignore. You're Godwin the Cooper, a peasant farmer living in a small English village in 1347, and you're about to discover why your weekly ale brewing isn't just a hobby, it's literally keeping your family alive. But first, let me explain why the water that flows past your village would probably kill you faster than a sword to the gut. Picture your village, 37 families clustered around a muddy road that turns into a swamp every time it rains. The houses are cramped, dark, and built so close together that you can hear your neighbour Thomas arguing with his wife about the roof leak that's been dripping for 3 months. Everyone's roof leaks, everyone's floor is dirt, and everyone's drinking water comes from sources that would make a modern person immediately projectile vomit. The village well sits exactly 20 feet from the communal latrine pit. This isn't poor planning, this is medieval reality. Nobody understands how disease spreads through contaminated water, so nobody sees a problem with human waste seeping into the groundwater that everyone drinks. The well water has a brownish tint and smells faintly of decay, but that's just normal. You've been drinking it your entire life, and you're still alive, so clearly it's fine. Except it's not fine. That water is teeming with bacteria that cause dysentery, cholera, typhoid fever, and a dozen other intestinal nightmares that medieval people just call the flux or the gripes. These diseases kill more people in your village than warfare, plague, and accidents combined. But nobody makes the connection between bad water and explosive diarrhea because the sickness doesn't always strike immediately. You might drink contaminated water on Monday and not get sick until Thursday. So how could water be the problem? Your village priest, Father Edmund, actually encourages people to drink from the well because he believes suffering purifies the soul. He's noticed that people who drink well water seem to experience more spiritual trials, violent stomach cramping, bloody stools, dehydration that makes them delirious. He interprets this as God testing their faith. The fact that people who drink ale seem healthier just proves they're avoiding spiritual challenges through sinful indulgence. But you know better, even if you can't articulate why. You've noticed that your neighbour William, who drinks well water exclusively because he's too poor to afford grain for brewing, spends about 3 days every month, doubled over with intestinal pain. His children are constantly sick with stomach ailments. His wife Margaret looks 20 years older than she actually is because chronic dehydration has aged her prematurely. Meanwhile, your family drinks ale with every meal, and while you're certainly not healthy by modern standards, you don't spend your days sprinting to the latrine with liquid fire shooting out of your bowels. You don't know that the brewing process kills harmful bacteria, but you know that ale drinkers stay healthier than water drinkers. That's enough. So every week, you brew ale, not because you're an alcoholic or because you enjoy the taste, though you do, but because ale is the only safe beverage available to your family. Water will kill you. Milk spoils within hours and often carries its own diseases. Wine is expensive and mainly available to wealthy people. Ale is liquid nutrition that doesn't carry death sentences. The brewing process starts on Monday morning before dawn. You wake up to complete darkness because glass windows don't exist in peasant houses, and candles are too expensive for casual use. You feel your way to the hearth, where yesterday's coals should still be warm enough to restart a fire. You blow gently on the embers, add dried grass and twigs, and pray the fire catches quickly because you've got 6 hours of brewing ahead of you. Your wife Emma is already awake because brewing is a family operation that requires multiple sets of hands. She's checking the grain stores to make sure last week's barley harvest is still dry and mold-free. Mouldy grain will ruin an entire batch of ale, which means your family goes without safe drinking water for a week. Mouldy grain can also poison you, causing hallucinations, seizures, and death. Emma has become an expert at detecting the early signs of grain spoilage, the slightly sweet smell, the discolored kernels, the powdery residue that indicates fungal growth. Your daughter Agnes, who's 12 years old and has been helping with brewing since she could walk, begins grinding grain with a hand quern, basically 2 heavy stone discs that crush barley into coarse flour. This is back-breaking work that takes hours and leaves your arms and shoulders screaming with pain. Agnes can only work in 20-minute intervals before her small frame gives out, so the grinding process stretches across the entire morning. The sound of grain grinding fills your house, a rhythmic scraping noise that starts before sunrise and continues until midday. Every family in the village makes the same sound on the same schedule because everyone brews on the same day to share resources and labor. The village sounds like a giant mill on Monday mornings, dozens of quern stones grinding in slightly different rhythms, creating a droning chorus that announces brewing day to anyone within miles. While Agnes grinds grain, you're building up the fire to heat your brewing cauldron. This isn't a neat little pot. It's a massive iron vessel that holds 15 gallons of liquid and weighs more than you do when it's full. Heating that much water to the right temperature requires serious fire management. Too hot, and you'll boil off all the liquid. Too cool, and the brewing process won't work properly. You don't have a thermometer, obviously, so you judge temperature by how the water moves. Cold water sits still. Warm water develops tiny bubbles around the edges. Hot water produces steady streams of bubbles. Boiling water churns violently. You want hot water with steady bubbles, what modern brewers would call 150 to 160 degrees Fahrenheit. Getting the temperature right requires constant attention because medieval fires are unpredictable. Wind can make flames flare up suddenly, overheating your water. Rain can dampen the fire, dropping the temperature too low. You spend the morning adding fuel, adjusting logs, and monitoring the water like your life depends on it, because it does. Emma handles the most critical part of the process, managing the mash. She slowly adds ground barley to the hot water, stirring constantly to prevent clumps from forming. This creates a thick, porridge-like mixture called wort that smells like liquid bread. The stirring motion looks easy, but try mixing 15 gallons of thick, hot liquid with a wooden paddle for 40 minutes straight. Emma's arms are corded with muscle from years of brewing, and she can stir longer than most men in the village. The timing is crucial. If you add the grain too quickly, it clumps together and doesn't release its sugars properly. If you add it too slowly, the water temperature drops and the extraction process fails. If you stir too vigorously, you create foam that interferes with brewing. If you don't stir enough, the grain settles to the bottom and burns. Emma has been doing this for 15 years, and she still occasionally ruins a batch by misjudging the timing. While the mash steeps, you're dealing with the smell. Brewing ale fills your house with a warm, yeasty aroma that's actually quite pleasant, like bread baking mixed with beer fermentation. But your house is also filled with smoke from the fire, because medieval chimneys are crude and inefficient. Your eyes water constantly, your throat burns, your clothes absorb so much smoke that you smell like a campfire for days after brewing. After 2 hours of careful temperature management, you strain the liquid through a basket lined with straw and cloth. This separates the sweet wort from the spent grain, which you'll feed to your pigs and chickens. Nothing gets wasted in medieval peasant life. Even the grain mash becomes animal feed that eventually turns into meat and eggs. The straining process requires 3 people working in coordination. Emma holds the straining basket steady while you pour the hot wort through slowly. Agnes catches any overflow in smaller containers. One mistake here can ruin hours of work. Tip the basket too far, and grain particles contaminate your wort. Pour too fast, and wort splashes everywhere, wasting precious liquid. Move too slowly, and the wort cools down before you can complete the next step. Now comes the part that medieval people don't understand, but instinctively know is important: boiling the wort. You return the strained liquid to the cauldron and bring it to a vigorous boil for at least an hour. You think this step improves the flavour and helps preserve the ale longer. You're actually sterilizing the liquid, killing all the harmful bacteria and parasites that would otherwise make your family sick. This is where ale brewing becomes accidentally brilliant public health policy. Medieval people stumble onto one of the most effective water purification methods available: extended boiling followed by alcoholic fermentation. They don't know why it works, but they know it does work, so they keep doing it. During the boiling phase, you add herbs for flavouring. Hops won't become common in English brewing for another century, so you use whatever's available locally. Wild rosemary for a piney taste, bog myrtle for a slightly bitter flavour, sometimes honey if you're feeling prosperous, occasionally ground eggshells if you want the ale to clarify faster. The herb selection process is more art than science. You taste the wort at different stages and adjust accordingly. Too sweet? Add more bitter herbs. Too harsh? Add honey or sweet herbs. No flavour at all? Add whatever strong-tasting plant you can find. Some villages develop signature flavours based on local herbs, creating ales that taste completely different from neighbouring communities. While the wort boils, Emma prepares the fermentation vessel. usually a large wooden barrel that's seen better days. She scrubs it with hot water and salt, then rinses it with small amount of previous ale to introduce the right kind of yeast. Medieval people don't understand yeast biology, but they know that using the same barrel repeatedly produces more consistent results. The barrel preparation is critical because wild yeasts and bacteria are everywhere, and most of them will ruin your ale. You want the specific yeast strains that produce alcohol and pleasant flavors, not the ones that create vinegar or cause the liquid to rot. Using a barrel that previously held good ale increases your chances of getting good fermentation, though you're still at the mercy of environmental factors you can't control. After an hour of boiling, you cool the wort as quickly as possible. In summer, this means carrying buckets of hot liquid outside and setting them in whatever shade you can find. In winter, you might pack snow around the containers. Fast cooling prevents unwanted bacteria from multiplying while the liquid is still warm, but not hot enough to kill contaminants. The cooling process reveals another challenge of medieval brewing: temperature management without thermometers. You test the wort temperature by dipping your finger quickly into the liquid. Too hot to touch means it needs more cooling time. Warm but not painful means it's ready for yeast. Cool to the touch means you've waited too long and risk contamination. Once the wort reaches the right temperature, you transfer it to the fermentation barrel and wait. Within hours, the liquid starts bubbling as yeast converts sugars into alcohol and carbon dioxide. The bubbling sound becomes a constant background noise in your house for the next 3 days. It's actually quite soothing, a gentle gurgling that tells you the brewing process is working correctly. But here's where medieval brewing gets complicated. You have no control over alcohol content. Modern brewers can calculate alcohol percentage based on sugar content and yeast strains. You're working with wild yeasts of unknown potency, converting unknown amounts of sugar into unknown quantities of alcohol. Your ale might be 2% alcohol, barely stronger than water. It might be 8% alcohol, strong enough to get you drunk on half a cup. This unpredictability creates social problems. Sometimes your weekly ale batch is so weak that it provides minimal alcoholic sterilization, increasing the risk of waterborne illness. Sometimes it's so strong that your family staggers around drunk for days, making farm work dangerous and difficult. You learn to taste test each batch carefully and adjust consumption accordingly. The fermentation process also produces foam that bubbles over the top of the barrel, creating a sticky mess on your floor that attracts flies and rodents. Medieval houses don't have smooth, washable floors. They have packed dirt that absorbs spilled ale and becomes a permanent breeding ground for insects. Your house always smells faintly of fermentation, even when you're not actively brewing. After 3 days, the vigorous bubbling subsides, and your ale is ready to drink. But ready is a relative term. Medieval ale is cloudy, chunky, and filled with sediment that settles to the bottom of containers. It's more like liquid bread than modern beer, thick, nutritious, and substantial enough to constitute a meal. The taste varies wildly depending on grain quality, herb selection, and fermentation conditions. Sometimes it's pleasant, mildly sweet, with herbal notes and a satisfying bread-like flavor. Sometimes it's harsh and bitter. Sometimes it tastes like vinegar because the fermentation went wrong. You drink it anyway because the alternative is well water that will definitely make you sick. Your family consumes about 1 gallon of ale per person per day. This sounds like massive alcohol consumption, but remember that medieval ale is relatively weak and serves as both beverage and food. 1 gallon of 3% ale provides significant calories, vitamins and minerals, while delivering only moderate amounts of alcohol, probably less than a modern person might consume in 2 or 3 beers. The daily ale consumption creates a lifestyle that's mildly intoxicated by modern standards. Medieval peasants maintain a slight buzz most of the time, which probably helps them cope with the constant physical pain of manual labour and the psychological stress of living in a world where death is always imminent. They're not falling down drunk, but they're not completely sober either. This permanent mild intoxication has social consequences. Village meetings tend to be louder and more argumentative than they might otherwise be. Domestic disputes escalate more quickly when everyone involved has been drinking ale all day. But the same mild intoxication also reduces anxiety and depression, making it easier to cope with medieval life's grinding hardships. The brewing schedule dominates your weekly routine. Monday is brewing day, requiring the entire family's attention from dawn to dusk. Tuesday through Thursday, you drink the fresh ale while it's still actively fermenting and slightly sweet. Friday and Saturday, the ale is at peak flavour and alcohol content. Sunday, you're drinking the last of the batch, which is often turning sour and vinegary. This creates a weekly cycle of nutrition and intoxication. Early in the week, when the ale is fresh and sweet, your family gets maximum calories and vitamins. Later in the week, when the ale is stronger and harsher, you get more alcohol and less nutrition. By Sunday, you're basically drinking fermented grain soup that barely qualifies as ale. The brewing process requires substantial grain supplies, about 15 pounds of barley per week for a family of 4. This represents a significant portion of your agricultural output. You're essentially converting food into safe drinking water, which seems wasteful until you remember that drinking regular water might kill you. The grain you put into ale brewing is an investment in your family's survival. During bad harvest years, you face an impossible choice: eat the grain and risk dying from contaminated water, or brew the grain and risk starving. Some families alternate weekly between brewing and eating grain, accepting periodic exposure to waterborne illness in exchange for additional calories. Other families reduce the grain content of their ale, producing weaker, less safe beverages that still provide some protection against contaminated water. The social aspects of brewing create village hierarchies based on ale quality. Families who consistently produce good ale gain status and influence because everyone wants to learn their techniques. Families who regularly ruin their brewing become social outcasts because bad ale suggests incompetence and poor judgment. Your neighbour Aldrich has developed a reputation for exceptional ale brewing through careful attention to grain selection and fermentation timing. People seek his advice on brewing techniques, and he's often invited to taste other families' ales to provide feedback. This expertise translates into social capital that helps him negotiate better deals for grain purchases and land rentals. Conversely, your neighbour Osbert consistently produces terrible ale that tastes like vinegar and barely provides alcoholic sterilization. His family suffers frequent illnesses that everyone attributes to his poor brewing skills. Other villagers avoid social contact with Osbert's family, partly because they don't want to drink his ale, and partly because chronic illness suggests divine disfavour. The brewing process also creates gender roles that seem progressive by medieval standards. While men typically handle the heavy lifting and fire management, women control the critical technical aspects of brewing: timing, temperature, ingredient ratios, and quality control. A skilled brewing wife is considered extremely valuable, and men sometimes marry specifically for brewing expertise rather than physical beauty or family connections. Emma's brewing skills were actually a major factor in your marriage negotiations. Her father emphasized her technical knowledge and consistent results when discussing the marriage contract with your family. You've heard men in other villages complain about wives who can't brew proper ale, treating it as a serious marital problem comparable to infertility or disobedience. But brewing also creates health problems that medieval people don't recognize. The constant exposure to smoke during brewing damages your lungs and throat. The repetitive stirring motions cause joint problems in your shoulders and elbows. The heavy lifting involved in moving full cauldrons and barrels leads to back injuries that never fully heal. More seriously, the reliance on ale as primary nutrition creates dietary imbalances. While ale provides calories and some vitamins, it doesn't supply adequate protein, fresh vegetables, or essential nutrients. Medieval peasants, who drink mostly ale, often suffer from nutritional deficiencies that cause tooth loss, skin problems, and weakened immune systems. The brewing process also consumes enormous amounts of fuel mass, wood that must be gathered, chopped, and stored year-round. In areas where forests are depleted, fuel costs can represent the largest expense in ale production. Some families spend more on firewood for brewing than they spend on grain, making ale an expensive necessity rather than an affordable luxury. During winter months, brewing becomes even more challenging because cold temperatures slow fermentation and increase fuel requirements. You might need to keep the fermentation barrel near the fire to maintain proper temperature, competing with cooking and heating needs for limited fuel supplies. Winter ales often take twice as long to ferment and require constant attention to prevent freezing. The seasonal variations in brewing create corresponding changes in village social life. Summer brewing is often communal, with families sharing fires and labour to reduce individual workloads. Winter brewing is more isolated, with each family struggling independently to maintain proper conditions. These seasonal patterns affect everything from marriage negotiations to commercial relationships. Storage limitations mean you can't brew more than 1 week's supply at a time. Ale without preservatives spoils quickly, especially in warm weather. You've experimented with adding extra herbs or honey to extend shelf life, but medieval preservation techniques are crude and unreliable. This means you're locked into the weekly brewing cycle, regardless of other priorities or emergencies. The brewing schedule conflicts with other essential activities like planting, harvesting, and market days. During harvest season, you're torn between spending Monday brewing ale and spending Monday gathering crops before they spoil. During planting season, you're torn between brewing and preparing fields. There's never enough time for everything, so you constantly juggle competing priorities. The physical demands of brewing also limit who can participate in the process. Elderly people often can't manage the heavy lifting and long hours required for ale production. Sick or injured family members become burdens rather than contributors during brewing days. This creates household tensions when some members consume ale without contributing to its production. Children learn brewing skills gradually, starting with simple tasks like gathering fuel and progressing to more complex responsibilities as they mature. Your son Robert, now 10 years old, can manage the fire and monitor water temperature, but isn't strong enough for stirring or lifting. Your daughter Agnes can handle most brewing tasks, but lacks the experience to troubleshoot problems when fermentation goes wrong. The learning process involves constant trial and error, because brewing knowledge is transmitted orally through observation rather than written instructions. Each family develops slightly different techniques based on their equipment, local ingredients, and past experiences. This creates village-specific brewing traditions that persist for generations. Quality control remains frustratingly inconsistent despite years of experience. External factors like weather, grain quality, and seasonal variations affect brewing outcomes in ways you can't predict or control. You might follow exactly the same process for months, producing consistently good ale, then suddenly create an undrinkable batch for reasons you can't identify. The unpredictability of brewing outcomes creates chronic anxiety about your family's water security. If a batch goes bad, you face a week of choosing between contaminated well water and no beverages at all. Some families maintain emergency supplies of older ale that's turning vinegary, but still provides some alcoholic sterilization, though this solution creates its own health problems. The brewing process also generates substantial waste products that create sanitation challenges. Spent grain attracts rodents and insects. Fermentation byproducts create sticky residues that are difficult to clean without soap or modern detergents. The constant production of organic waste in your living space contributes to the generally unsanitary conditions of medieval peasant life. Despite all these challenges, you continue brewing every week because the alternative is worse. Waterborne diseases kill more people in your village than warfare, accidents, and violence combined. The families who attempt to save time or resources by skipping brewing cycles consistently suffer higher rates of illness and death. Your weekly brewing routine represents a form of primitive public health policy that works despite not being understood. The combination of boiling, fermentation, and alcohol content creates a beverage that's infinitely safer than available water sources. Even though the brewing process is labor-intensive, resource-consuming, and technically challenging, the irony is that you're accidentally implementing one of the most effective water purification methods available, using technology and techniques that won't be scientifically understood for another 500 years. Medieval peasants stumbled onto a solution to waterborne illness through trial and error, cultural transmission, and sheer necessity. So when you raise your cup of cloudy, chunky, mildly alcoholic ale on Sunday evening, you're not just drinking fermented grain, you're drinking the accumulated wisdom of generations of people who figured out how to survive in a world where the most basic necessity, clean water, was a luxury that didn't exist. You're drinking a technology that kept your ancestors alive long enough to become your ancestors. And tomorrow you'll start the whole process again, because survival isn't a one-time achievement. It's a weekly routine that never ends. Your brother Matthias, a Benedictine monk living in a monastery near Florence in 1453, and you've just become the most dangerous person in your community without realizing it. People travel for days to seek your expertise in dream interpretation, but what they don't understand is that every dream you analyze could be evidence of heresy, witchcraft, or political treason that might get everyone involved burned at the stake. Your reputation as a dream interpreter started accidentally 3 years ago, when you correctly predicted that Brother Augustine's recurring nightmare about flooding meant he would soon receive devastating news from his family. When word arrived that his father had drowned in a fishing accident, the entire monastery decided you possessed divine gift for reading God's messages in dreams. This was both a blessing and a curse that you're still trying to navigate. The problem is that dream interpretation in the 1400s isn't just a matter of psychological insight or spiritual guidance. Dreams are considered direct communications from supernatural forces, either God, angels, demons, or sometimes the devil himself. When you interpret someone's dream, you're essentially making theological pronouncements about divine will, spiritual warfare, and the cosmic battle between good and evil. Get it wrong, and you might inadvertently encourage heretical thinking or demonic influence. Your cell in the monastery serves as an unofficial dream consultation office, 3 mornings each week. The space is barely large enough for 2 people to sit comfortably, with stone walls that amplify whispered conversations and make private consultations impossible. A small wooden crucifix hangs above your writing desk, next to a collection of dream interpretation texts that represent centuries of accumulated wisdom and dangerous speculation. The texts themselves are problematic. You own a Latin translation of Artemidorus's ancient Greek dream manual, which contains interpretations that contradict Christian doctrine. You have excerpts from Islamic dream interpretation guides that were translated during the Crusades, bringing foreign theological concepts into Christian dream analysis. Most controversial of all, you possess handwritten copies of folk dream interpretations that blend Christian symbolism with pre-Christian superstitions that the Church officially condemns. Every morning before dream consultations begin, you spend an hour in prayer, asking God to guide your interpretations and protect you from demonic deception. Dream interpretation requires spiritual discernment that distinguishes between divine visions, natural dreams caused by physical conditions, and supernatural communications from evil forces. Making the wrong determination could lead to spiritual disaster for both you and your consultants. Your first visitor today is Elena, a merchant's wife from the village below the monastery. She's in her 30s, well-dressed by peasant standards, but her hands shake as she describes a recurring dream that's been troubling her for weeks. In the dream, she sees herself standing in her kitchen, but instead of bread baking in her oven, there are human hands reaching out from the flames, grasping for help that she cannot provide. Elena's dream interpretation requires careful navigation of theological and social minefields. Dreams about ovens and fire often symbolize purification, spiritual transformation, or divine judgment. But dreams about human suffering might indicate guilt over specific sins, demonic temptation, or prophetic visions of future events. The reaching hands could represent souls in purgatory, asking for prayers, demonic entities trying to drag her toward damnation, or symbolic representations of people she's failed to help in her daily life. You begin with standard questions designed to establish the spiritual context of Elena's dream. Has she been fasting or eating unusual foods before bedtime? Medieval medicine holds that diet directly affects dream content, with rich foods producing vivid nightmares and fasting producing prophetic visions. Has she been reading scripture or participating in religious activities before sleep? Spiritual preparation often influences whether dreams carry divine messages or merely reflect earthly concerns. Elena admits that she's been eating meat during Lent, a serious sin that she's hidden from her confessor because her husband insists they can't afford to follow fasting requirements during their current financial difficulties. This revelation changes everything about her dream interpretation. The burning hands might represent her guilt over breaking religious law, or they might be a divine warning about the spiritual consequences of continued disobedience. But here's where dream interpretation becomes dangerous. If you tell Elena that a dream indicates divine displeasure with her Lenten violations, you're essentially requiring her to confess serious sins to her priest and accept whatever penance he assigns. This might include public humiliation, substantial financial payments to the church, or physical punishments that could affect her family's economic survival. Your dream interpretation has real-world consequences that extend far beyond spiritual guidance. Alternatively, if you suggest that Elena's dream represents a call to greater charity, that the reaching hands symbolize poor people who need her help, you might be encouraging her to give away resources that her family desperately needs. Medieval charity expectations can bankrupt families who take them too seriously, especially when local priests pressure wealthy merchants to demonstrate their spiritual worthiness through financial generosity. You decide to take a middle approach, suggesting that Elena's dream reflects her spiritual sensitivity to the suffering of others and her desire to help people in need. You recommend increased prayer and modest charitable giving, while avoiding specific directives that might cause financial hardship or require confession of serious sins. It's a careful balance between providing spiritual guidance and avoiding potentially disastrous consequences. Elena leaves apparently satisfied with your interpretation, but you know that other people will scrutinize whatever advice you've given. Her husband might question why she's suddenly increasing charitable donations. Her confessor might wonder why she's asking about Lenten fasting rules. The local bishop might hear rumors about dream interpretations that seem to contradict official church teachings. Every consultation creates ripple effects that you can't predict or control. Your next visitor is Thomas, a young farmer whose dreams are far more troubling than Elena's. He describes visions of angels with black wings, teaching him new prayers in a language he doesn't recognize. The angels show him sacred symbols that don't appear in any Christian texts, and they promise him spiritual knowledge that will help him achieve salvation without requiring church mediation. Thomas's dream interpretation ventures into genuinely dangerous territory. Dreams about angels receiving non-Christian revelations could indicate divine visions that supersede church authority, demonic deceptions designed to lead him toward heresy, or psychological disturbances caused by spiritual pride and ignorance. All three possibilities carry serious risks for both Thomas and anyone who counsels him. If Thomas's dreams represent genuine divine revelation, then dismissing them might constitute resistance to God's will. Medieval Christianity acknowledges that God sometimes communicates directly with individuals, bypassing official church channels. Saints and mystics throughout history have received divine visions that initially seem to contradict established doctrine. But distinguishing between genuine divine revelation and demonic deception requires spiritual discernment that even experienced theologians sometimes lack. If Thomas's dreams represent demonic influence, then encouraging him to pursue the knowledge they offer could lead him toward witchcraft, heresy, or spiritual damnation. Demons are known to disguise themselves as angels of light, offering false wisdom that gradually corrupts human souls. The fact that Thomas's dream angels are teaching him prayers in unknown languages strongly suggests demonic influence, since God typically communicates in ways that humans can understand. If Thomas's dreams represent psychological disturbance, then providing religious interpretation might reinforce dangerous delusions that could lead to erratic behavior, social isolation, or complete mental breakdown. Medieval understanding of mental illness is primitive, but experienced spiritual counselors recognize that some people who claim divine visions are actually suffering from natural conditions that produce hallucinations and false beliefs. You question Thomas carefully about his spiritual practices and daily life. Has he been experimenting with folk magic or consulting with wise women who use herbs and charms? Has he been reading unauthorized religious texts or participating in unofficial prayer groups? Has he been fasting excessively or engaging in extreme penitential practices that might affect his mental state? Thomas reveals that he's been studying Latin texts that he borrowed from a traveling scholar who claimed they contained ancient Christian wisdom lost to the modern church. He's also been practicing breathing exercises and meditation techniques that the scholar taught him, designed to increase spiritual sensitivity and open his mind to divine communication. This information confirms your worst suspicions. Thomas has been exposed to potentially heretical teachings through unauthorized sources, and he's been practicing spiritual techniques that might invite demonic influence. The ancient Christian wisdom he's studying could be Gnostic texts, Islamic mystical writings, or even pre-Christian magical practices disguised as Christian spirituality. The meditation techniques are particularly concerning because they mirror practices used by heretical sects that claim direct access to divine knowledge without church mediation. The Cathars, Waldensians, and other condemned groups often taught breathing exercises and contemplative practices that supposedly enabled practitioners to receive divine revelations. These techniques are considered gateways to demonic influence because they encourage spiritual pride and independence from proper religious authority. You face an impossible choice in interpreting Thomas's dreams. If you declare them demonic and forbid him from pursuing the knowledge they offer, you might be protecting him from spiritual danger, or you might be suppressing genuine divine revelation. If you acknowledge the possibility that his dreams carry authentic spiritual messages, you might be encouraging heretical thinking that could destroy his soul and implicate you in promoting false doctrine. The political dimensions of dream interpretation complicate your decision even further. The traveling scholar who taught Thomas these techniques might be connected to underground religious movements that challenged church authority. If Thomas continues pursuing unauthorized spiritual knowledge, he might eventually be investigated by religious authorities looking for evidence of organized heresy. Your interpretation of his dreams could become evidence in trials that determine whether people live or die. You decide to strongly discourage Thomas from continuing his current spiritual practices while avoiding direct condemnation of his dreams. You suggest that he focus on traditional prayer, confession, and participation in authorized religious activities, rather than pursuing exotic spiritual techniques. You recommend destroying the unauthorized texts and avoiding contact with the traveling scholar who provided them. Thomas seems disappointed by your conservative advice, but he agrees to follow your recommendations. However, you suspect that he'll continue his unauthorized practices in secret, possibly seeking dream interpretation from less cautious sources. Folk healers, village-wise women, and traveling fortune tellers offer dream analysis without the theological constraints that limit your options, though their interpretations often blend Christian symbolism with practices that the Church considers witchcraft. Your third consultation involves Margaret, an elderly widow whose dreams have become increasingly political in nature. She describes visions of the local duke being devoured by wolves, while angels stand by without intervening. She sees tax collectors sinking into the earth, while poor people rise into the sky. Most troubling of all, she dreams of priests wearing crowns of thorns while demons dress in papal robes. Margaret's dreams venture into seditious territory that could result in accusations of treason, heresy, or both. Medieval law treats prophecies about political rulers as potential threats to public order, especially when they predict violence or divine judgment against established authorities. Dreams that criticize religious leaders might constitute heretical attacks on church hierarchy that carry penalties ranging from excommunication to execution. The symbolism in Margaret's dreams is particularly dangerous because it can be interpreted as social commentary disguised as spiritual vision. Wolves devouring rulers often represent popular uprising against unjust government. Tax collectors sinking into the earth suggests divine punishment for economic oppression. Angels refusing to intervene implies that God approves of political violence against corrupt authorities. The most problematic element is Margaret's vision of demons wearing papal robes, which directly attacks the legitimacy of church hierarchy. This type of symbolism appears frequently in the dreams and visions of heretical movements that claim the official church has been corrupted by worldly power and demonic influence. Interpreting such dreams in ways that validate their anti-clerical message could constitute heretical teaching, punishable by severe penalties. You question Margaret about her political opinions and recent experiences with local authorities. Has she been affected by recent tax increases or legal disputes? Has she been listening to sermons or conversations that criticize local rulers or church officials? Has she been exposed to written materials that contain seditious ideas or heretical theology? Margaret reveals that her family has been financially ruined by tax increases designed to fund the Duke's military campaigns. Her son was killed in a recent war, that most people consider unjust and wasteful. Her parish priest has been demanding increased donations while refusing to provide adequate spiritual services to poor parishioners. She's clearly angry about social injustices that affect her daily life. This context suggests that Margaret's dreams reflect her legitimate grievances against corrupt authorities rather than genuine prophetic visions of divine judgment. However, the distinction between justified social criticism and seditious prophecy is often unclear in medieval legal practice. Dreams that accurately reflect popular discontent can still be treated as threats to public order if they encourage resistance to established authority. You choose to interpret Margaret's dreams as expressions of spiritual longing for justice rather than political prophecies about specific events. You suggest that her visions reflect God's concern for social justice and care for the poor, without endorsing the specific predictions about rulers being devoured by wolves or tax collectors sinking into the earth. You emphasize the importance of prayer and patience rather than active resistance to unjust authorities. Margaret accepts your interpretation, but clearly remains unsatisfied with advice that counsels passive acceptance of injustice. You suspect that she'll seek additional dream interpretations from sources that might be more willing to validate her political frustrations. Folk prophets, wandering preachers, and underground religious movements often provide dream analysis that explicitly supports resistance to corrupt authorities. The afternoon brings additional consultations that reveal the full complexity of medieval dream interpretation. Brother Francis, a fellow monk, describes dreams about reading forbidden books that contain mathematical formulas for predicting the future. Sister Agatha, from the nearby convent, dreams about conversations with the Virgin Mary that contradict established theological doctrine. A local merchant named Giovanni dreams about discovering hidden treasures that belong to Jewish families who were expelled from the region decades ago. Each consultation requires careful navigation of theological, legal, and social considerations that extend far beyond simple spiritual guidance. Dream interpretation in the 1400s involves making pronouncements about divine will, supernatural influence, political loyalty, and religious orthodoxy. Every interpretation carries potential consequences for both the dreamer and the interpreter that can affect their spiritual salvation, social standing, legal status, and physical safety. The theological framework for dream interpretation creates additional complications. Medieval Christianity holds that dreams can originate from 4 possible sources: natural physical conditions, human psychological states, divine revelation, or demonic influence. Determining which source produced a specific dream requires spiritual discernment that depends on the interpreter's theological knowledge, personal holiness, and supernatural insight. Natural dreams result from physical conditions like illness, dietary choices, or environmental factors. These dreams carry no spiritual significance and require no interpretation beyond practical advice about health and lifestyle. However, distinguishing between natural dreams and supernatural communications often proves impossible, especially when physical and spiritual factors interact in complex ways. Psychological dreams reflect the dreamer's mental and emotional state without involving supernatural influences. These dreams might reveal unconscious fears, desires, or memories that affect the person's spiritual life and moral choices. Interpreting psychological dreams requires understanding human nature and providing appropriate spiritual counsel without attributing supernatural significance to natural mental processes. Divine dreams carry authentic messages from God, angels, or saints that provide guidance, warnings, or revelations about spiritual matters. These dreams deserve serious attention and careful interpretation because they represent direct communication from supernatural sources. However, false claims about divine dreams can lead to spiritual pride, disobedience to church authority, or dangerous theological errors. Demonic dreams result from evil supernatural influences that seek to deceive, tempt, or corrupt human souls. These dreams often appear to contain spiritual wisdom or divine revelation, but they actually promote heretical thinking, moral corruption, or resistance to legitimate religious authority. Recognizing demonic dreams requires exceptional spiritual discernment and extensive knowledge of theological doctrine. The practical challenge of dream interpretation involves applying this theological framework to specific cases where the supernatural significance remains unclear. Most dreams contain elements that could be interpreted as natural, psychological, divine, or demonic, depending on the interpretive approach and the interpreter's theological assumptions. The same dream might be dismissed as meaningless digestion problems or elevated to the status of prophetic divine revelation. Your training in dream interpretation began with years of studying classical and medieval texts that provide conflicting guidance about dream analysis. Artemidorus's ancient Greek manual emphasizes symbolic interpretation based on cultural associations and personal circumstances. Islamic dream interpretation guides focus on religious symbolism and moral guidance derived from Quranic teachings. Christian theological texts emphasize discernment between divine and demonic influences while maintaining proper submission to church authority. The conflicting interpretive traditions create methodological problems that affect every consultation. Classical approaches often contradict Christian theology by attributing supernatural significance to dreams that Christian doctrine considers natural phenomena. Islamic approaches sometimes provide insights that improve interpretive accuracy, but incorporate theological concepts that the Church considers heretical. Folk traditions offer practical wisdom about dream symbolism, but blend Christian teachings with pre-Christian practices that might constitute witchcraft. Your personal approach to dream interpretation attempts to synthesize these various traditions while avoiding theological errors that could endanger your spiritual standing or legal status. You begin each consultation with prayer for divine guidance and protection against demonic deception. You gather detailed information about the dreamer's spiritual practices, moral condition, and recent experiences that might influence dream content. You analyze dream symbolism using multiple interpretive frameworks while prioritizing Christian theological principles. The interpretive process requires constant vigilance against spiritual pride and theological error. Dreams that seem to provide divine revelation often appeal to human desires for special knowledge or spiritual superiority over other people. Dreams that criticize established authorities often reflect legitimate grievances disguised as supernatural communications. Dreams that promise hidden wisdom or secret knowledge often originate from demonic sources that exploit human curiosity and ambition. The social dimensions of dream interpretation create additional pressures that affect your theological judgments. People who seek dream analysis often have specific expectations about what their dreams mean and what advice they should receive. Wealthy patrons expect interpretations that validate their social status and political opinions. Poor people expect interpretations that promise divine justice for their suffering. Religious authorities expect interpretations that support church teachings and clerical authority. These social expectations conflict with theological principles that require interpreting dreams according to divine truth rather than human preferences. Providing interpretations that please your consultants might compromise your spiritual integrity and lead to theological errors. Providing interpretations that contradict popular expectations might damage your reputation and reduce your ability to provide spiritual guidance to people who genuinely need help. The economic aspects of dream interpretation further complicate your role as spiritual counselor. While you don't charge fees for consultations, people often provide donations that support your monastery and fund your continued studies. Wealthy consultants sometimes offer substantial gifts in exchange for favorable interpretations of their dreams. Poor consultants often can't afford any donations but desperately need spiritual guidance that might help them cope with difficult circumstances. The potential for economic corruption in dream interpretation creates constant temptation to adjust your theological judgments according to financial considerations. Dreams that predict success for wealthy patrons might result in generous donations, even if those interpretations lack proper theological foundation. Dreams that counsel patience and acceptance for poor consultants might be easier to provide than interpretations that require expensive spiritual remedies or challenge unjust social conditions. Your reputation as a dream interpreter also affects your standing within the monastery and the broader religious community. Successful interpretations that prove accurate enhance your spiritual authority and influence among both religious and secular leaders. Failed interpretations that prove inaccurate damage your credibility and might raise questions about the authenticity of your spiritual gifts. The pressure to maintain interpretive accuracy creates temptation to provide vague, ambiguous advice that can be interpreted as correct regardless of future events. Dreams about spiritual purification can be interpreted as predicting either positive spiritual growth or necessary trials that prepare the soul for salvation. Dreams about material prosperity can be interpreted as promising either worldly success or spiritual wealth that transcends material concerns. However, overly cautious interpretations fail to provide the specific guidance that people seek when they consult dream interpreters. Consultants want concrete advice about practical decisions, specific predictions about future events, and clear direction about spiritual practices that will improve their religious standing. Generic interpretations that avoid specific commitments often leave consultants unsatisfied and seeking alternative sources of spiritual guidance. The legal risks associated with dream interpretation require constant awareness of political and religious sensitivities that change according to local circumstances and broader historical developments. Dreams that seem innocuous during periods of political stability might be treated as seditious during times of social unrest. Interpretations that conform to established theological doctrine might become controversial when church teachings evolve or when local religious authorities change. Recent political developments have increased the dangers associated with dream interpretation in ways that affect your daily consultations. The fall of Constantinople to Ottoman forces has created anxiety about Islamic influence on Christian spirituality. The ongoing struggles between church councils and papal authority have made theological speculation more dangerous. The rise of humanist scholarship has introduced classical ideas that sometimes conflict with medieval Christian doctrine. These broader historical changes influence how religious authorities evaluate dream interpretation and spiritual counseling. Practices that were previously considered acceptable expressions of popular piety might now be scrutinized as potential sources of heretical thinking or foreign influence. Interpretive methods that drew from classical or Islamic sources might now be considered evidence of dangerous theological speculation. Your position as a dream interpreter places you at the intersection of popular spirituality, official theology, and political authority in ways that require constant vigilance and careful judgment. Every consultation involves weighing theological principles against pastoral concerns, spiritual discernment against practical consequences, and personal conviction against institutional loyalty. The cumulative effect of providing dream interpretation over several years has changed your understanding of human nature, divine communication, and the relationship between spiritual and material reality. You've observed patterns in dream symbolism that suggest genuine supernatural communication in some cases and natural psychological processes in others. You've witnessed the power of interpretive guidance to provide comfort, direction, and hope to people struggling with difficult circumstances. But you've also seen how dream interpretation can be manipulated to serve political agendas, economic interests, and personal ambitions that have little to do with authentic spiritual guidance. You've encountered people who use claims about divine dreams to justify immoral behavior, challenge legitimate authority, or gain social influence through supposed spiritual superiority. As evening approaches and your consultation day ends, you spend time in prayer reflecting on the spiritual significance of the dreams you've interpreted and the advice you've provided. Each consultation represents a moment when supernatural and natural reality intersect in ways that affect human souls and earthly circumstances. Your role as interpreter places you in a position of tremendous responsibility for the spiritual welfare of people who trust your judgment about divine communication. The loneliness of dream interpretation becomes apparent during these evening reflections. Unlike other forms of spiritual counseling that follow established theological guidelines, dream interpretation requires personal discernment that can't be easily verified through external sources. You make judgments about supernatural reality based on limited information and uncertain interpretive principles, knowing that errors might have eternal consequences for both yourself and your consultants. Tomorrow will bring additional consultations with people seeking understanding of dreams that might contain divine revelations, demonic deceptions, or natural phenomena disguised as supernatural communications. Each consultation will require the same careful balance of theological knowledge, spiritual discernment, pastoral concern, and practical wisdom that makes dream interpretation both necessary and dangerous in the medieval world. The irony of your position is that the people who most need authentic spiritual guidance are often the least able to distinguish between genuine divine communication and convincing counterfeit messages that exploit their spiritual hunger. The wealthy and powerful can afford multiple consultations with different interpreters, allowing them to shop for advice that suits their preferences. The poor and desperate often accept whatever interpretation they receive, regardless of its theological accuracy or practical wisdom. This social dynamic means that dream interpretation can either serve justice by providing spiritual comfort to those who need it most, or it can perpetuate injustice by reinforcing the social advantages of those who can afford better spiritual guidance. Your commitment to providing honest interpretation, regardless of the consultant's social status, represents a small attempt to use spiritual authority in service of divine justice, rather than human hierarchy. As you prepare for sleep, you're aware that your own dreams will be influenced by the spiritual weight of serving as an interpreter of supernatural communication. The responsibility of distinguishing between divine and demonic influences in other people's dreams creates spiritual vulnerability that requires constant prayer and self-examination. Tomorrow's consultations will once again test your ability to serve both divine truth and human need in a world where the two don't always align perfectly. You're Isabel, a cloth merchant's daughter living in ruin in 1456, and you're about to experience the most psychologically torturous activity known to medieval humanity: waiting for someone when you have absolutely no idea what time it is, how long you've been waiting, or whether the person you're expecting even understands when they're supposed to arrive. Your betrothed, Guillaume, promised to meet you after the morning bells, but before the midday meal at the cathedral steps to finalize arrangements for your wedding feast. This sounds specific enough until you realize that morning bells might ring anywhere from dawn to mid-morning, depending on the season, church politics, and whether Brother Thomas remembered to wake up on time. The midday meal could happen anywhere from late morning to mid-afternoon, depending on your family's work schedule, available food, and social obligations that might delay or accelerate dining plans. So you're standing on cold stone steps outside Notre Dame de Rouen, with absolutely no way to measure the passage of time, except for watching shadows move, counting church bells that ring at irregular intervals, and observing the gradual changes in foot traffic as the city slowly wakes up. You might be here for 20 minutes or 4 hours, and you'll have no way of knowing which until Guillaume either appears or you finally give up and go home. The psychological torture of medieval waiting begins immediately. Without any reference point for measuring time, every moment stretches into an eternity of uncertainty. Has it been long enough that Guillaume should have arrived already? Is he late, or are you early? Did you misunderstand the meeting time, or did he? Is he stuck in traffic, which in medieval terms means a cart blocking the narrow street, a funeral procession, or a herd of pigs being driven to market? Or has he simply forgotten about the appointment entirely? You try to estimate time by watching the cathedral's shadow move across the square, but medieval sundial reading requires mathematical knowledge that most people don't possess. The shadow seems to be moving, but you can't tell if it's moved enough to indicate that Guillaume is officially late. Plus, clouds keep blocking the sun, making shadow-based time estimation even more unreliable. You're essentially trying to measure time using a sundial that you don't know how to read during weather that makes sundials useless. The church bells provide another time reference, but medieval bell ringing schedules are inconsistent and contextual rather than precise. The bells ring for morning prayers, but the exact timing depends on when the priest wakes up and whether there are special religious observances that alter the normal schedule. They ring for various daily offices, prime, terce, sext, none, but these canonical hours shift with the seasons and don't correspond to fixed clock times that everyone understands. You've heard 3 sets of bells since arriving, but you're not sure if they represent 3 different hours or the same hour being announced by different churches with slightly different schedules. Churches don't coordinate their bell ringing, so you might hear the same canonical hour announced multiple times as various religious institutions mark their own prayer times, or you might miss entire canonical hours if the local bell ringer is sick, busy, or simply forgetful. The foot traffic patterns provide another clue about time progression, but interpreting these patterns requires intimate knowledge of local daily routines that varies by season, weather, and social circumstances. Early morning brings farmers carrying produce to market, but early morning could mean anything from before dawn to mid-morning, depending on when they started their journey and how far they travelled. Market vendors setting up stalls usually arrive at roughly the same time each day, but their schedule depends on factors like weather, seasonal changes in available goods, and competition for the best-selling locations. You watch a bread seller arrange his wares and assume this indicates early morning, but then you remember that bakeries operate throughout the day, producing multiple batches of bread to meet continuous demand. The bread seller might be setting up for the first time today, or he might be restocking after selling his morning inventory. His presence tells you nothing definitive about what time it is or how long you've been waiting. A group of masons walks past carrying tools toward a construction site, suggesting that the working day has begun in earnest. But construction workers start at different times depending on the season, the specific project requirements, and their contractual arrangements with whoever hired them. Summer construction often begins before dawn to avoid working during the hottest part of the day. Winter construction might not start until mid-morning, when temperatures become bearable. The mason's movement tells you something about time progression, but not enough to determine whether Guillaume is late. Children begin appearing in the square, some carrying water buckets, others driving small groups of chickens or goats toward feeding areas. This usually indicates that households are beginning their daily routines, but children's schedules are determined by family needs rather than standardized time requirements. A child might be sent for water immediately after waking up, or they might perform this task after completing other morning chores. Their presence suggests that the day is progressing, but doesn't provide specific information about duration or punctuality. You try to count your own heartbeats as a timing method, but medieval people have no concept of heart rate as a consistent time measurement. You know that your heart beats faster when you're nervous or excited, and slower when you're calm or resting, but you have no baseline measurement that would allow you to calculate elapsed time based on heartbeat counting. Plus, your anxiety about Guillaume's punctuality is affecting your heart rate in ways that make this method completely unreliable. Breathing patterns provide another internal timing reference, but these are equally unreliable for time measurement. You try counting breaths, but your breathing changes with anxiety, physical activity, and environmental factors like cold weather or dust in the air. After what feels like several hundred breaths, you realize you have no idea whether several hundred breaths represents 10 minutes, 30 minutes, or an hour of waiting time. The gradually changing quality of light provides the most reliable indicator of time passage, but interpreting these changes requires experience and attention that most people don't develop. Morning light has a different color and intensity than midday light, but the transition happens so gradually that detecting moment-to-moment changes is nearly impossible. Cloud cover affects light quality in ways that can make late morning look like early morning, or early afternoon look like late morning. You notice that the shadows in the square have definitely shifted since you arrived, but you can't quantify the shift in terms of actual time elapsed. The shadow movement confirms that time is passing, but doesn't tell you whether you've been waiting for 20 minutes or 2 hours. Without a baseline understanding of shadow movement rates, observing shadows just confirms the obvious fact that the sun continues moving across the sky. Your stomach provides another internal time indicator, but hunger schedules vary wildly based on when you last ate, how much you ate, what kind of food you consumed, and your current activity level. You're starting to feel hungry, but this could indicate that your normal meal time is approaching, or it could just mean that standing in cold weather while feeling anxious has increased your appetite. Medieval people eat when food is available rather than according to fixed schedules, so hunger tells you nothing reliable about time. The temperature seems to be warming slightly as the sun climbs higher, suggesting that morning is progressing toward midday. But weather changes throughout the day in ways that don't always correlate with time progression. Cloud cover can make midday feel like morning. Wind patterns can make afternoon temperatures feel like morning coldness. You're definitely less cold than when you first arrived, but this could mean you've been standing here for hours, or it could just mean that you've adjusted to the outdoor temperature. Other people in the square seem to be going about their business without any apparent time anxiety, suggesting that punctuality concerns might be specific to your situation rather than a general social problem. But medieval people don't display their time anxiety publicly because everyone understands that time measurement is difficult and approximate. Someone else might be equally frustrated about tardiness while maintaining an outward appearance of calm acceptance. You observe a woman who appears to be waiting for someone near the fountain, but you can't tell if she's experiencing the same time anxiety that you're feeling. She might have been waiting longer than you, or she might have just arrived. She might be waiting for someone who's already late, or she might be early for an appointment that's still in the future. Her presence confirms that other people also wait for appointments in public spaces, but provides no useful information about timing or punctuality. A merchant begins setting up a cloth display near the cathedral entrance, suggesting that commercial activity is beginning for the day. But merchants start business at different times depending on their specific trade, competition for selling space, and seasonal variations in customer patterns. Some merchants begin setting up before dawn to claim the best locations. Others wait until mid-morning when foot traffic increases. The cloth merchant's activity indicates that the commercial day is progressing, but doesn't provide specific timing information. You consider leaving to look for Guillaume elsewhere, but this creates additional time measurement problems. If you leave and he arrives shortly afterward, you'll miss each other and have to start the entire coordination process over again. If you stay and he's been delayed by something that will keep him busy for hours, you'll waste an entire day standing in the cathedral square without knowing how long you've already waited or how long you should continue waiting. Deciding when to give up becomes an impossible calculation. The social implications of punctuality add psychological pressure to the time measurement difficulties. In medieval society, keeping someone waiting can indicate disrespect, poor planning, or insufficient commitment to the relationship. But arriving early and waiting for a long time can also indicate over-anxiousness, social awkwardness, or misunderstanding of proper timing conventions. You want to demonstrate appropriate respect for the appointment without appearing desperate or socially inept. Guillaume's tardiness might reflect legitimate delays that have nothing to do with his attitude toward you or your upcoming wedding. Medieval travel is unpredictable because of weather, road conditions, animal behavior, and unexpected social encounters that can delay any journey. He might have been stopped by someone who needed help with an emergency. He might have encountered muddy roads that slowed his progress. He might have been delayed by family obligations that he couldn't abandon without causing offense. Alternatively, Guillaume's absence might indicate that he misunderstood the appointment time, forgot about the meeting entirely, or deliberately chose not to come because of second thoughts about the wedding arrangements. Medieval communication is imprecise enough that miscommunication about meeting times happens regularly. People often rely on verbal messages transmitted through third parties, creating multiple opportunities for timing details to be misunderstood or forgotten. The anxiety of waiting without time reference creates physical symptoms that make the experience even more unpleasant. Your shoulders tense up from standing in cold weather and maintaining alert posture for an unknown duration. Your feet begin to ache from standing on stone pavement without knowing how much longer you'll need to remain in position. Your neck starts to hurt from constantly scanning the square for Guillaume's arrival. The mental fatigue of sustained attention without time boundaries becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. You try to watch for Guillaume while also monitoring time indicators like shadows, foot traffic, and church activities, but this requires continuous concentration that exhausts your mental resources. Your attention begins to wander, creating anxiety that you might miss Guillaume's arrival or misinterpret timing cues that could help you decide whether to continue waiting. You start to question your memory of the original appointment details. Did Guillaume actually say after morning bells but before midday meal, or are you remembering a different conversation? Did he specify which morning bells or which midday meal? Medieval appointments often include multiple conditional clauses that create ambiguity about exact timing after the morning bells, weather permitting, unless there are family obligations that require attention. The lack of standardized time references makes it impossible to verify your memory against objective timing standards. You can't check whether your recollection of the appointment time matches Guillaume's understanding because there's no external time measurement system that would allow you to compare interpretations. Both of you might remember the appointment details accurately, while still having completely different understandings of when the meeting should occur. You observe a group of students walking toward the cathedral school, suggesting that educational activities are beginning for the day. Medieval schools operate on schedules that vary by season, religious calendar, and local traditions, but they generally begin their activities sometime during the morning hours. The student's appearance provides another data point about time progression, but doesn't offer precise timing information that would help you evaluate Guillaume's punctuality. A dog wanders through the square, pauses to investigate interesting smells, and then continues on its way. The dog's behavior has no relationship to human time measurement, but watching its casual movement highlights the contrast between your time anxiety and the animal's complete indifference to scheduling concerns. Medieval people often live closer to natural rhythms that prioritize immediate needs over artificial time constraints, but social obligations require coordination that natural rhythms don't provide. You notice that several people have entered and exited the cathedral since you arrived, suggesting that religious activities are continuing throughout the morning. People attend church services at various times depending on their personal devotional practices, work schedules, and social obligations. Some people attend multiple services throughout the day, while others only participate in major religious observances. The flow of people in and out of the cathedral confirms that time is passing, but doesn't indicate specific durations or provide timing references. The sound of hammering from a nearby construction site becomes more frequent and intense, suggesting that craftsmen are settling into their daily work rhythm. Medieval artisans often begin work slowly, spending time organizing tools, discussing the day's plans, and preparing materials before beginning intensive labor. The increased hammering activity indicates that the working day is progressing beyond the initial setup phase, but doesn't provide specific timing information. You begin to feel slightly dizzy from standing in one position for an extended period, but this could result from anxiety, cold weather, hunger, or simple fatigue, rather than indicating any specific duration of waiting time. Medieval people are accustomed to physical discomfort during daily activities, but sustained waiting in cold weather creates particular challenges that affect both physical comfort and mental state. A church bell rings again, but you've lost count of how many bell sequences you've heard, and can't determine whether this represents a new canonical hour or a repeat announcement of a previous hour. Different churches ring bells for different purposes, calling people to prayer, announcing deaths, marking religious festivals, or simply reminding the community that the church remains active. Without understanding the specific bell ringing conventions of each nearby church, interpreting bell sounds for time measurement becomes impossible. You consider asking other people in the square about the time, but medieval people don't carry personal timepieces and rely on the same inconsistent timing references that you're already using. Someone might tell you that it's mid-morning or approaching midday, but these descriptions are subjective interpretations based on the same observational cues that have already proven unreliable for your purposes. Moreover, asking about time might reveal your social awkwardness about punctuality and waiting, which could reflect poorly on your family status and your personal sophistication. Medieval social interactions require maintaining appropriate dignity and composure, especially in public spaces where your behavior might be observed and discussed by people who know your family's reputation. The gradual increase in market noise suggests that commercial activity is expanding as more vendors arrive and customer traffic increases. Medieval markets operate on informal schedules that vary by season, weather, and local custom, but they generally become busier as the morning progresses. The increasing noise level provides another indicator of time progression, but doesn't offer specific timing information. You watch a woman feeding chickens in a nearby courtyard, a domestic activity that usually occurs sometime during the morning, but can happen at various times depending on family routines and animal needs. The chicken feeding confirms that household activities are underway, but doesn't indicate whether you've been waiting for a short time or a long time. A group of pilgrims walks through the square carrying staffs and wearing travel clothes, heading toward the cathedral to pray before continuing their journey. Pilgrims travel on schedules determined by weather, distance between destinations, and religious calendar requirements, rather than precise time management. Their presence indicates that the day is progressing enough for serious travel activities to be underway, but doesn't provide specific timing references. You realize that your initial confidence about recognizing Guillaume when he arrives is beginning to waver as your sustained attention becomes less focused. Medieval urban environments are crowded and visually complex, making it difficult to maintain effective surveillance of all possible approach routes. You might have missed Guillaume's arrival because you were watching the wrong direction, or you might have seen him without recognizing him because distance and crowd movement affect visual identification. The possibility that Guillaume has already come and gone without your noticing creates a new layer of anxiety about time management and appointment coordination. If he arrived while you were distracted by time measurement concerns, he might now be waiting somewhere else, or might have concluded that you failed to keep the appointment. Medieval communication systems don't provide ways to resolve this type of coordination failure quickly or efficiently. Your hands are becoming numb from cold weather, making it difficult to maintain manual dexterity that might be required for whatever business you're supposed to conduct with Guillaume. Medieval winter weather affects all outdoor activities, but waiting without knowing the duration of exposure makes it impossible to prepare appropriately for cold-related discomfort. A cat appears in the square, finds a sunny spot near the cathedral wall, and begins grooming itself with the unhurried attention that cats devote to personal hygiene. The cat's behavior exemplifies the natural rhythm approach to time that doesn't involve artificial scheduling constraints, but observing the cat's leisurely grooming routine also highlights how much mental energy you're spending on time, anxiety that the cat completely avoids. You notice that the quality of light in the square has definitely changed since your arrival, becoming brighter and more direct as the sun climbs higher in the sky. This confirms that substantial time has passed, but doesn't quantify the duration in ways that would help you evaluate Guillaume's punctuality or decide whether to continue waiting. The sound of children playing in a nearby courtyard becomes more prominent, suggesting that morning household chores have been completed and children have been released for recreational activities. Medieval children's schedules are determined by family work requirements rather than standardized timing, but play activities usually occur after essential morning tasks have been finished. You observe a priest walking slowly around the cathedral exterior, possibly conducting some kind of inspection or contemplative exercise. Religious personnel operate on schedules determined by liturgical requirements and personal devotional practices rather than commercial or social timing conventions. The priest's measured pace and serious demeanor suggest that religious activities are proceeding according to their own internal logic that doesn't necessarily correspond to secular time concerns. A merchant begins calling out prices for his goods, indicating that he expects customer traffic to be sufficient to justify active selling efforts. Medieval market timing depends on customer patterns that vary by season, weather, and local economic conditions, but vendors usually begin aggressive selling when they expect potential buyers to be present and ready to make purchases. The accumulation of time indicators, shifting shadows, changing light quality, increasing market activity, progressing household routines, confirms that significant time has passed since your arrival, but still doesn't provide precise duration measurement that would allow rational decision-making about punctuality and appointment coordination. You begin to realize that the fundamental problem isn't Guillaume's tardiness or your time measurement difficulties, but the entire medieval approach to scheduling that relies on approximate timing references rather than precise coordination systems. Everyone understands that appointments are approximate, delays are normal, and successful coordination requires patience and flexibility rather than punctuality and precision. This understanding doesn't reduce your anxiety about the specific appointment with Guillaume, but it provides cultural context that makes the waiting experience feel less personally frustrating. Medieval social life operates on rhythms that prioritize adaptability over efficiency, relationship maintenance over time management, and acceptance of uncertainty over control of circumstances. A bell tower clock would solve your time measurement problems, but mechanical clocks won't become common in European cities for another century. Even when public clocks become available, they often disagree with each other and require constant adjustment by skilled technicians who don't always maintain consistent schedules themselves. You watch a woman hanging laundry in a window across the square, a domestic activity that usually occurs when weather conditions are favorable and household schedules permit. The laundry hanging suggests that morning household work is progressing, but doesn't indicate specific timing that would help evaluate your waiting situation. The realization that medieval time management is fundamentally different from modern precision timing helps explain why Guillaume's apparent tardiness doesn't necessarily indicate disrespect or poor planning. Medieval people approach appointments as approximate coordination efforts rather than precise scheduling commitments, understanding that successful meetings depend more on persistence and patience than punctuality and efficiency. A group of apprentices hurries past carrying tools toward various workshops, suggesting that the artisan community is settling into serious work activities. Medieval crafts operate on schedules that vary by trade, season, and customer demand, but most workshops begin intensive production sometime during the morning hours after completing setup and planning activities. You decide to wait a bit longer while adjusting your expectations about punctuality and time measurement to match medieval cultural norms rather than modern timing assumptions. Guillaume will probably arrive eventually, and when he does, neither of you will know exactly how long you've been waiting or whether anyone was actually late, according to the original appointment understanding. The shadows have definitely moved, the light has clearly changed, market activity has obviously increased, and various daily routines have visibly progressed since your arrival. These observations confirm that time has passed and the day is advancing, even though you still have no precise measurement of duration or reliable basis for evaluating punctuality. When Guillaume finally appears, walking quickly across the square with an apologetic expression, you'll both understand that medieval appointment coordination succeeded despite the absence of precise time measurement. Neither of you will know exactly how long you waited or whether anyone was actually late, but the successful meeting will demonstrate that human patience and social flexibility can overcome the limitations of primitive timing technology. The experience of waiting without clocks teaches medieval people that time is flexible, relationships require patience, and successful coordination depends more on persistence than precision. These lessons shape a cultural approach to time that prioritizes social harmony over efficiency, adaptability over control, and acceptance of uncertainty over anxious planning. Tomorrow you'll face similar coordination challenges that require the same patience and flexibility, because medieval life operates on natural and social rhythms rather than artificial time constraints. Learning to wait without time measurement becomes an essential social skill that enables community coordination, despite technological limitations that make precise scheduling impossible.